Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Formed by Jesus podcast. We're not in a season right now. We're just talking about the vision for 2025, and then we'll be at season 7 starting next month through the practice of fasting. How you feeling about that?
Oh, that's crazy. I never thought about that. Season 7. We will be doing our 7th practice. It went by pretty quick.
I know. You'll see the Formed by Fasting booklet right up there. You can't tell.
I know, that's
via the camera.
thing. Yeah.
It's perfect. But that is already available at formedbyjesus.com/fasting, brought to you by Pastor Caleb. So if you see any typos, there isn't any, because we have Emily Heaton, our communications director, does a wonderful job. She edits so quickly too.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm proud of you for this one. You didn't say towards a lot.
Yeah. Towards. But I do have Emily's red highlights in my head as I'm writing it.
Amazing.
I'm like, what would she do? What would she
What would
change?
Emily do?
Yeah. And I like to think that I see less and less highlights now,
I think so.
Which
That,
means
or she just took care of it and didn't. She just
Didn't, yeah.
made the. But it was so funny because the previous one, I didn't know towards isn't the correct word. I didn't know toward.
Yeah.
I didn't know you couldn't necessarily. People do it and it's fine, but I guess it's like
It's like how you say
some
height.
sort of weird rule. Do I say that?
You say height.
I say it?
Width and height. Yeah.
You're saying that's a Trey problem?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
Height.
No, you'll say like width and height.
Yeah. I have a lot of issues.
It's like the same thing where in the moment it sounds right, and then you're like, oh wait, is that toward? Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah. Wow.
Good morning.
Didn't realize I said height. That's not a word?
No. I thought we had talked about this before. That's why I brought it up. I didn't mean to call you out on national radio.
Height is a dialectal variation of the word height.
Which is a nice way of saying it's wrong.
Oh, it's from the Old English.
Oh, okay.
So I just read so much of the Middle Ages that
It's like the worst era to read theology from.
it's like the most embarrassing. How many angels can stand on
Yeah.
top of a pen?
Right before then you're good, and right after that you're
Well, what's the
good.
height of the pen?
Yeah. What's the height?
That was a good. Anyways,
Banter.
it's old-fashioned and a mistake, but it is a mistake in modern English.
Yeah.
I didn't know I did that.
Height.
The biggest realization I had was when you told me you and Shelby talked about how I eat.
What?
With
With your fork? I don't have a pen or something, but yeah, you hold your fork like a caveman and just like a shovel.
Viking feast, man, for
Yeah,
life.
I guess so. Yeah.
And I guess there's not that many people who eat that way.
My kids eat that way.
I just never noticed.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
There's a lot of stuff I had a guy's name in my mind, but there's no
Yeah.
use to throw him under the
Yeah,
bus.
why are you trying to drag people down with you?
I'm getting better.
I haven't noticed that in a while, so maybe you subconsciously or intentionally, I don't know.
I just don't eat with you anymore.
I guess not, yeah.
We practice hospitality.
We do finger foods, if
away.
anything. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's Vision Month. It's my favorite month because I love vision.
Oh, January is your favorite month?
You know, it is one of my favorite months. For the church calendar, I love January.
Yeah.
I find so much joy. And I think let's just step right into this. It's a conversation you and I have been having offline. You and I had a wonderful conversation like the very first of the year. It was like January 3rd. No, or was it like December 31st? Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's literally useless. But we're talking about APEST, the fivefold ministry, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, and how to really find your voice as a communicator. It's to understand what is your primary gifting, and preach from that sort of
Oh,
gifting.
yes.
And I think apostolic, lowercase a, is that more vision casting, kind of shaping things. I'd like a more robust definition, but that's essentially starters. Church planners are often apostolic. But to me, I think like this vision series is apostolic in nature. And so it's just so fun for me to create and think and process. So yeah, I really like January.
Yeah. It's a fun time. It's so broad too. Cause I think that's the, like, my fear is always that we're being too 30,000 feet. But it's helpful. I think we're laying the groundwork for the rest of the year. And then it is fun to see, cause that honestly is kind of a new thing for us, right? Like, we haven't always done that.
No, we started it last year.
Yeah.
And how to make friends, love other people. And then we kind of, remember we talked about the 4 stages of friendship, and then you can see each stage would couple with one of the practices. So it was a proximity, which was just proximity. Vulnerability, which we matched that with, proximity we matched with hospitality. Vulnerability, we matched with peacemaking, which is super vulnerable. The next stage is practice. Doing the thing, and that we practice, and we coupled that with generosity. So we've kind of done that.
Yeah.
And then the last one was mission, but that's really all of this year now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It is the first time I think we've done it this explicit, where we tell people in the sermon series, here's our whole teaching calendar for the year. It's essentially what we've been doing. I haven't done that perfectly yet. It's kind of my plan maybe for this Sunday to kind of like show an image of like how these all work together. But yeah, I don't know if we'll always do that, because I think it's bad to always hitch yourself to a wagon. That just seems to be maybe working right now, but it works for my brain.
Yeah. I think last year too, we saw a lot of, because I think that's the tricky thing, is doing what we're trying to do when we prep for the year. And when we think through the calendar and the teaching calendar, the preaching calendar, the practices and everything, is like figure out what, not just like what sounds fun or what do we want to do, but like what's the growth edge of our church?
Right.
Like what's the next thing that we want to kind of push past? And I think what we noticed in 2023 was that we had a hard time kind of building community, and people were still like coming into our church, not knowing each other and things like that. So we were like, okay, this is clearly a growth area for us. So
and our society too, naturally.
Yeah, it was
in a post-COVID world. It's like we haven't gone back to regular rhythms of fellowship. Yes.
So we focused 2024 on that, and I think we saw the fruitfulness of that. And then at the tail end of last year, talking about generosity and stuff, we started to realize that I think a big weakness of both of ours is like outreach. Like, we love the discipleship, the once you're in, how do we grow and how do we follow Jesus together is sort of the bread and butter of our church.
And I love marketing where, like, hopefully an outsider would find it appealing, but that's not the same thing as outreach. You know, like, I think we have some skills that help with it.
But like the practice of like witnessing is an underused muscle, I think, for me at least. So
yeah, no, I agree. And I've been thinking about that a lot. Cause we're talking about witness this Sunday. So in my prayer walk this morning, do you know, 8th grade, I led 50 kids to Christ. But what I mean by that is I led 50 people to the sinner's prayer. And so it was super transactional. And I have no idea. I mean, even then I was like, I don't know if they're going to go to church, but they're not going to hell now. And so like, I was thinking about that, because thinking through the APES thing, we've just quickly have both said evangelist is not our thing. And I hate that. For me personally, I come from a long line of evangelists. So I almost feel like I'm letting down their legacy, but it's also, so then it's trying to parse out how much of it is an excuse and how much of it is gifting, like a wiring. Because none of us are, we're jumping into next week's topic, but none of us are given a pass. We all have to share the gospel, and we do share the gospel. But yeah, I don't know. It's so hard to parse that out.
Yeah, I think, and then you get into what's going to be tough is weeding through, like, because this touches at the heart of your theology. Like, what does salvation actually mean? Like, what does it mean to really be saved? And I think a huge conviction of ours, and in a lot of ways, I think this makes it great for us to start talking about mission now, is we kind of put the cart before the horse, where we push, at least, so growing up, I can't speak for everybody, but my experience, especially in my youth group and things like that, was all on one of the first things you do when you get saved is like you go and you share your faith with others and you bring others in. And I think there's something really beautiful and empowering about that focus. But you eventually get to that point where you're like, what are you inviting people into?
Exactly.
Like, what is it that they're, because then it
It
gets,
almost just becomes a multi-level market where the only thing
Yeah.
we're doing is we're all sharing. Like,
We're
but
all-
what are we sharing? What are we bringing them into? Exactly. what you're saying.
maybe we all go to youth group together, but then we're still going and living, our lives that don't look any different than the way they were before and things like
Right.
that. And so I think
So
what we've,
our ministry has been to see that blind spot and try to compensate for it and like try to lead against that, which I think is good and true and beautiful.
yeah,
But then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait,
yeah.
we haven't talked about evangelism in a while.
Now I think we've kind of built a decent foundation where people, like, I think that a few years ago, had we brought people into the church more, had that been a focus, I think there would have been a lot of questions about what it means to follow Jesus in the day-to-day life that we wouldn't have had good answers for. And I think now this can sound arrogant, and I don't mean for it to, but I think our people have hopefully experienced enough discipleship to Jesus to where when we start focusing on reaching our lost neighbors and friends and coworkers, we actually have something to invite them into other
Yeah.
than, the elevator pitch, don't go to hell when you die kind of a thing,
Yeah.
which is still true, but
Which I'm so excited to talk about that next week. And I'm going to be consulting your outreach workshop in my sermon prep
oh yeah.
for Sunday because it's about doing the work of evangelists and the theology of the gospel. I was going to bring something up, but then I went on that rabbit trail. I remember 2 years ago, I think it was in our Vision series or right before the Vision series in 2022, at the end of 2022, I mentioned how like, okay, kind of what we're looking at doing is presence, formation, mission. And we were saying how like the presence of God and spiritual formation, I viewed them as like two tires on a bike. And if both of them are filled up, you're naturally like the bike ride's a whole lot easier. You're like moving forward on mission. So we were saying like I grew up in a context where like formation was kind of ignored. The presence of God, I don't think was ignored, but it's really hard to ride a bicycle when one tire is flat. And so I think that was what we were trying to do. And I think it's also helpful to remember, I think healthy spiritual leadership is not trying to fix everything at one time. It's saying, okay, what is this next season for us? Kind of like the farmer analogy that Paul tells us to think about, is what is this next season? Yes, there's always stuff that we have to do, and there's always things we've missed out on, but we have felt through prayer and through guidance, and it's always fun that you and I kind of like bring up the idea at the same time, which I think is a good confirmation. It's a good way to honestly verify and check and see if the Lord is speaking to us, is that, okay, year 1, 2023 of the Formed by Jesus thing is very vertical. Let's become Sabbath people who read scripture and simplify our lives. Then we saw the need for community. We did that all year long. And now we're saying like there needs to be a sense of urgency. We need to be fasting for the sake of our neighbor, which we'll talk about this next month. We need to be praying for the lost. We need to be witnessing. So I'm so excited. I think it's really going to push our people. I think every year I've said like this is going to be the hardest one. And I guess that's great by design. It feels like this next one's going to be the hardest one.
Yeah, I think so. I think starting to prep for prayer a little bit, but then I'm thinking through witnessing, and I think that's going to be a hard thing to like.
Yeah, in 4 weeks.
Because what you're trying to do essentially is provide a template,
and a
you're trying to
theology.
systematize it to an extent, not like a one size fits all kind
But
of a
some
thing.
of the problem has been we've over systematized it, right?
Yeah. So how do you do that for something like witnessing?
That's
like
gonna be fun.
gospel tracks and knocking on doors.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're gonna do, but maybe.
I don't know.
We haven't written it yet.
Stick around. I actually think I know. Never mind.
Say it.
I often feel super unprepared. Like I'm nervous. I haven't read too much on prayer yet, but I'm like, we have to get through the fasting. Like to me, my brain has to be done with the teaching part of fasting, not the practice of it. We've been doing the practice, but the teaching part before I can read the next book, on the different things. But then I talk to other pastors and they're like, I read a book on, see, this is why I didn't want to say it. But I have a friend, okay, who's like, I read a book on fasting on Monday. I'm going to go preach it on Sunday. It's like, okay, let it simmer a little while.
I think that's where we went. So it's not that we went wrong, but I think that early on when we started implementing some of this stuff or talking about it in our sermons, I think we had experienced it a little bit. Like we had practiced some of it, but there was no real methodical way that we were introducing it to people. It would kind of be at the end of a teaching. And I think it was good. We would say like, this week, try fasting. And everyone's like,
Oh, yeah.
what? okay, I guess, sure. Like give up 1 meal, give up 2 meals, but there was no
Next
real
week,
like
Sabbath.
Yeah.
We
Try
did a whole
Sabbathing.
series called Practicing the Way, and it was like 6 weeks of 6 different practices.
Sermon on
It's
the
like,
Mount.
You got it? Cool.
Yeah, which was
You
great.
said mound again. I love it. Praise the Lord.
Okay,
Okay, keep going.
you said height. So
I
we're
never
even.
said it today. You claim I said it. There's actually no proof that I've ever said.
We'll get our guy,
What
our
if-
editor,
yeah.
to mash.
Joke's
cut
on
a
you.
bunch
I'm the
of-
editor.
Yeah,
so,
so.
which we will. We're taking. We're not hiring.
If you want to come sit in the room
For
while we do
free.
this and then edit it afterwards for free,
That'd be amazing. So go ahead.
Great.
Let me know.
Anyways, yeah, I think that's what we did is we would read a lot and then we would try and tack it on because it was, but I think we were trying, like I got a little burnt out. I think, and we haven't really talked about rule of life like officially yet, but you know, it's really easy, I think, to create a system for yourself, a rule of life to live by that's impossible to sustain.
Right.
And so I think I burnt out a little quickly, and I think that's the tendency there. But now we're doing the
So
opposite,
what we're seeking to do is not burn out, but to burn clean.
which you said in your sermon.
See how I segued?
Circle back.
Yeah.
Good job.
So let's talk about endurance. This is a huge part of being formed by Jesus. A huge part, I think, of the second and the third soil, primarily the second, of course, is distress or persecution comes because of the word, and so they immediately fall away or they're offended and they leave. And endurance is so big. I think of Romans 5. I was actually reading all week in just my normal Bible reading time, and there's so many passages I wanted to mention in the sermon. And I think what I should start doing is like make a side page in my study, and then we can like talk about it here because it's like we didn't have enough time. But I think about that line that Paul has in Romans 5. What is it? It's like do you know the sequence of events? The character produces perseverance, perseverance produces hope. It's Romans 5.
Affliction produces endurance, endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope that will not disappoint us.
What a beautiful thing. And I hated hearing people say when we started our church, hey, you're going to overestimate what you do in a year and underestimate what you want to do in 10, because 10 years feels so far away when you're first starting. And now I'm very grateful for that paradigm. And I'm very grateful to look back at all the things we've had to endure. And I think, though, part of my frustration, and take this wherever you like, I think part of my frustration, though, in the beginning of my journey, I'm trying to give myself more grace because I think I was learning as much as I could 10 years ago, right? I like to bag on yesterday, be like, man, that guy was so dumb. And then I'll make fun of myself now, which they say, if you're not embarrassed of yourself 2 years ago, you're not growing enough. But I think, though, my paradigm of the purpose of the Christian life 10 years ago made the first 4 or 5 years of planting so hard because I thought it was just about reaching new people, and it wasn't, which absolutely. And that's what we're talking about this year. But I think what was helpful is that concept of theosis, where like I think maybe I would have had more endurance and courage, which I had enough endurance because we're still here, but I had so many depressing days because I didn't count the fact that probably what God was doing was forming me more than anything. Like my character, your character matters. Like that's a part of the process. And I just always thought, do you get where I'm trying to go?
Yeah.
I'm trying not to do this in a way that's self-congratulatory, which it's not. But I'm just saying, I think for a lot of us who are on the journey, if we remember a chief part of the Christian life is to become like him, all of a sudden this affliction, oh, this is producing character. So I'm going to stay in the fight, and I'm going to have patience. I think Colossians said that for endurance and patience. Like what a gift to have endurance and patience. And it ties to where like, that's how you please the Lord. Enduring and being patient in trials.
I've said this before, but I think Paul seems to talk about suffering as if it is just another spiritual practice. Like the way he talks about suffering and endurance is almost the same way that he taught. Like he would assume that he assumes we pray. Jesus assumes we're going to fast. It's assumed that we read the scriptures. I think for Paul, it was assumed that we suffer.
Which is very American for us to not see that.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot about, there are other podcasts that would do a better job explaining this that I know that I've listened to about why that shift happened in America, especially, but the goal suddenly became about convenience and comfort, pleasure, all of that.
Pleasure principle.
Bypassing suffering. If your suffering then became like indicative that something was wrong, it's just assumed that if you're suffering, something needs to change, or if you're enduring hardship or whatever.
Two thoughts on that then.
Yeah.
One is, have you read that theological concept where Paul really had this idea where like it's almost like suffering is a cup that we're filling up. Like all of us as Christians, as we suffer, like there is a point where we have to suffer. I'm probably doing a poor job of this. That's why you're on the team. But essentially it's like a theology where the church itself has to suffer, and it gets to this point of filling up the cup, and then the Lord will come back. It's like almost contributing to his coming back again. We have to take part in the suffering. So Paul was pumped about suffering. He even says, like, I have to suffer for the elect for the sake of their salvation. But it's like, no, Jesus' suffering on the cross is what saved the elect. Like that's the salvation part. But there's something where he thinks our suffering, his suffering, has a part to play. It's kind of confusing to me. There's a lot there. So chew on that. Can I go to the next topic? Can you go back to chewing on that? So Andrew Delbanco talks about those three paradigms of hope in American history. So at first, when the Puritans coming, their focus, their hope on life was God. Like it was God. That's what they were doing for. So then when God is the goal, suffering does make sense. Like it's like, okay, I'm suffering for the sake of the gospel. I'm suffering and I'm becoming more like him. Character's a thing. But then it became nation. So God, and then it kind of transformed where nation was the kind of primary idol or goal of our country. And there's some blessings that came from that. But also within that paradigm, suffering makes sense. You're proud for your children. Like you're proud for your son becoming a soldier and willing to die. And then if they do die, they at least, that was an honorable death. That was an honorable thing. So that gives hope. But then it goes from God to nation to self. The new idol since the 1960s is all about the idolization of the self. And what's really hard when you idolize the self, there's no framework for suffering. It makes no sense to endure pain because it's just about me. And so that is the shift that I've read about, Andrew Delbanco points to, which I learned from Timothy Keller. So that might be one reason why suffering makes no sense to us. Even this other book I just read on secular mysticism is this idea that Christians are even more and more unique because we claim there's something beyond this life. And there's a lot of people today who are like, no, this is all we have. So suffering makes no sense if this is the only life. So that's what makes us so unique. No, there's a next one. There's a resurrection. So it's actually stack up the suffering here because there's glory waiting for us on the other side.
Yeah, even like something like Buddhism exists to give you an answer to suffer, like a way to bypass suffering, which is like clear your life of all attachments and
kind of I know it's not stoic, but that kind of stoic branch. That assumption, numb yourself to it.
Which I mean, there's something like even in that thought, there is something good about that. That in like sometimes we too captive, we suffer because we're captive to things that God is trying to get us to give up control of. But I think the suffering that we're talking about. So yeah, that's an interesting thing too. I think Paul. I mean, and there's a lot of theological debate about Paul's eschatology. Like it seemed like he thought the world was ending in his lifetime, like Jesus was going to come back, and so there's an urgency I think in Paul's writing that is helpful. Obviously, Jesus did not come back in Paul's life, but
which again, and I kind of mentioned 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
I think last days. It's always last days between his ascension and the second coming. And if you think about it, every generation it is the last because we're not living forever. So it's like we all have to act like it's it because we're all going to die. So it is going to be it soon. Yeah. So there's a lot of wisdom, but not in being so urgent that all of a sudden you're fearful. Right? That's why we're saying we're not frantic, we're focused. Sorry to cut you off. Keep going.
No, that's good. Yeah, I think when you talk about suffering, I think it's also helpful to talk about like how do you, because I always struggled with this, like how do you define, like what is suffering? Like what's the hardship? I think that takes a level of maturity that's really hard. Like when you get to that point of like discerning, like, am I suffering because, am I the rich young ruler who's suffering because Jesus has asked me to give up my riches or give up the thing that's holding me back? Or am I suffering because I'm like Paul in that I have given up everything?
Yeah. And so then we go to church and it's like, Lord, give me comfort because I can't give up this idol. Like the rich young ruler going to church, like that was an encouraging message today. I'm inspired. I'm going to keep worshiping my idol of money. Yeah. Like I know that's so nuanced. And to me, that's like when you trust the Holy Spirit to do his work. That's partially why in the beginning of the message yesterday, I said, look, the three kind of broad categories that Paul had to endure within 2 Timothy is that persecution and imprisonment. That's suffering, like literally being put away for the gospel, abandoned by others. Like being abandoned is suffering, like Jesus being betrayed, us walking the Jesus way with people and then they leave and fall off. That's suffering. That's hurtful. And then physical and emotional pain. And that's where that can get dicey. But like that emotional pain, because sometimes you're having an emotional pain because you're immature and you are attached to an idol. And so you're suffering because you're putting your hope in something that is not worth putting your hope in. That makes it hard.
It's the pruning process.
Yeah.
John 15's pruning. Yeah, I think the way that I interpreted endurance yesterday and the type of suffering is like the suffering that we're talking about happens when following Jesus costs you something.
Yes, not just human suffering. We all suffer.
Right.
But because of the word, as Jesus says.
There's something
What
about
are those then?
receiving. Yeah, well, you mentioned it yesterday. We've talked about suffering and persecution before and how we don't experience, violent physical persecution in our country today. But we do experience, like, I think if you're following Jesus, then that will bring you in opposition to the natural cultural assumptions of the world today, which will then cost you. Like, like choosing to base your life around some sort of upward mobility. Like if every decision you make is based about getting more, having more, being more, doing more, that is, I think, at some level antithetical to the way of Jesus. And I think following Jesus, living a generous life and doing, bearing the fruit that Jesus is inviting us to bear, will require you to kind of reject that, like, assumption of upward mobility, and that will put you at odds with other people, and that will cost you job opportunities, and that will,
and even how you engage with entertainment. I'm thinking of the soldier being not caught up in civilian entanglements. Supposedly, so that's what's hard too, because all of the suffering, as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 4, is not really suffering compared to the eternal weight of glory. So we have to also mention, it feels like suffering, but come on, the reward we're going to get, not in this life, but in the one to come, how could one call it suffering? But I do think, we're going to a conference next week. So I've been listening to one of the main speakers, John Tyson, and people have been asking him, how do you read so many books? Like, you talk about this prayer life. How are you able to have that many hours of prayer? And he's like, bro, I haven't watched a TV show since the 90s. Like, I don't waste my time. Like, he goes, I'm not being a Pharisee by saying you all have to do this and you're not a Christian if you have a Netflix account. But he's like, my life, I want to be set apart, 2 Timothy 2:21, and consecrated to be used by God. And so I think that's also a good nuance to this conversation that I haven't found a time to put in our Mark 4 teachings. Because I'd love to know your thoughts. And Mark 4, are these 4 soils about salvation, or are they just about fruitfulness within a Christian life? I think that's what's hard about parables. You can almost look too much into them. And so I think you need other scriptures to help you with things. But I would say a lot of this, remember, fourth quarter, fourth soil, what we're saying is our paradigm this year is not like, are you saved or not? It's, are you living a consecrated life and being fully used by the glory of God to really be a fruitful person? To be like a Luther in the 1500s when everybody's in despair. Can you set your life apart in order to be used by God and change generations?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we had, I have a lot of thoughts. I think the degree that you want to be used by God will determine the degree of your suffering as well. So like if you're going to consecrate your whole life to God, I think that involves giving up a lot of things. Like for some people, entertainment's a really hard thing, or it's just PS5, which is hilarious that you never told me you had a PS5.
Oh, I never told you?
You never told me. The first time I found out was when I was reading your sermon notes. I was like, what? What is this? No, I think, there's I was in my seminary class on Thursday. We used Luke's telling of this parable in Mark 4, and their interpretation. The professor was saying that the word is not necessarily salvation. It can be, but it's also you can be different. So this is what he had said. You can be different soil in as it relates to different issues in your life. So for some things, God gives you something and you're the good soil, but then you have this other thing where you're like, you can't give this thing up. And so there's rockiness and distress happens because of this word that God has given you or this direction or calling or whatever. And I thought that was really helpful. I thought that was a really interesting take on the soils where we're not, I think on some level, this is a parable that Jesus is telling about salvation. But I think innate to the human experience is this idea that like God gives us things and we have to respond to it. Like we can receive what God is giving us and that's going to cost us, but there should be joy. That was the other thing I was going to say too, is we're not after like, I think if you look at what was happening sort of in the monastic, the extreme sort of desert father monastic movement, which there's a lot to commend about that. And I think some that's probably not so great, which is this desire to like, the more that I suffer, the holier that I am. And so there's this like
Puritans would do that too, right? Like I can't even enjoy flowers. Like let's cut them off because I found delight in them. I can only find delight in God. I know that's a dramatic example, but that's in the history books that I learned in English class.
Yeah. There's like a what's the word? Like a self-flagellation. That's not that we're not after that,
right?
Because alongside suffering, I think the more that you endure, and the type of hope that Paul is talking about in Romans 5 is very much like a you detach yourself from the things that are causing you suffering and from the things that you're afraid to lose in your following Jesus. And in that, you actually find deeper satisfaction and a joy that doesn't make any sense because of your endurance in suffering. And so alongside suffering is a deep sort of contentment that is possible if you continue following Jesus.
So the book Stories with Intent, which is like a great, robust study of the parables of Jesus, which we'll be consulting in September when we start our Parables of Jesus series. But Klein Snodgrass, the primary author, he argues, he does say some people look at the four soils and think it's just about salvation. And it's hard to like deny that when you see the first soil, like Satan comes, snatches away the word and it never took root. So I think there is a part of that where it's certainly true, but that's what I think I like about parables too. You can meditate on it and it's like a diamond. There's many different truths to it. That's also scary because you can come up with weird things from a parable. So there's a lot there that we'll teach in the fall. But I think when you consider biblical theology and what God has always said in his word about salvation and things, I think it's really helpful for the Christian to now read Mark 4 as, am I hearing and doing the word? Am I being a second soil in this area of life? Am I being a third soil just in general? That doesn't mean all of a sudden God hates me and I'm not in the kingdom. But wow, I have been worried. I have been caught up in the worries of this age, of the deceitfulness of wealth, the desires for other things. So yeah, I think it's helpful paradigms. I think it depends on which audience you are. Like I would certainly hope the non-believer coming into our congregation hears these four soils as, hey, let me warn you, come to the faith, actually receive the word, let it implant into you and begin to produce fruit, because that's how you'll know you are truly my disciples. So yeah, glad we covered that.
Yeah.
Anything else? This was actually a wonderful podcast.
Yeah. No, I think this has always been it's funny because this parable has come up this parable comes up a lot in my has come up a lot in my life, I think. Like this was the very first thing I remember when I started seminary. Have you started this semester yet? I forgot to ask you that.
No. Is that tonight?
Do you have class tonight?
I might.
When I first started seminary, one of the very first classes that they have you take is like an intro to ministry class. And I remember this was the very first thing we went through it was sort of like the task we were given as we started our, educational journeys or whatever. It was like, make sure you're the good soil because here are all the other like temptations to take you away. And it's funny how this is just kind of kept coming up because I think it is holistic. Like it talks about, you can read it through the salvation lens, but then it also is like, it maps out the Christian life. Like we're given something, we want to be fruitful with it, which I think is a hugely neglected part of what it means to be a Christian. If being a Christian is only about going to heaven instead of hell when you die, I think that's an incomplete gospel because of passages like this, where the end goal, according to Jesus, is some kind of receptivity that results in fruitfulness. And I think that is a more beautiful picture of salvation, where we receive forgiveness from our sins, we receive healing from our sins as long as we are continuing to give ourselves over to Jesus. And from that, we are able to do things like fulfill the Great Commission, and kind of live into the life that God has us. So
We didn't even say the word the growth edge too often in this podcast, but that's another good example of endurance. Is keep fighting the fight in those areas of the third soil. Don't give in. Keep pressing in, and you'll see so much fruit on the other side.
I also should say, I don't know. I'm sure like this isn't, it's not a process also. Like, I think it's helpful to remember, like, you can be the fourth soil, the good soil, and then other things in your life will come and like, you'll be the first soil or the second soil or the third soil. Like I think that's what's hard about the Christian life. And that's what requires endurance is like, you don't ever get there where these aren't issues anymore. Like, I think you're always tempted a little bit by something, whether it's the worries of this age, the deceitfulness of wealth, desire for other things. And I think you can learn to let go of those more and more, the more that you follow Jesus. But I think that
Each season brings new temptations.
exactly. Yeah.
First half of life is totally different than second half of life.
There will always be struggle. Like, you're always going to have to
Yeah,
examine
waging war.
yourself. Yeah. Yeah.
That's good. I think that's why, like, when even Paul says crucify the flesh, it's written in that perfect tense. Like, it's never, you're going to always be crucifying the flesh.
Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you guys so much, as always, for listening to the podcast. What's the word of the day? What should the comment?
Flagellation.
You're getting good at that.
Thank you.
Now, it's not flatulation, it's flagellation.
Yeah. Let me make sure I know how to spell that.
That's on them.
Okay. I got it.
All right, cool. We'll check. Did you check?
Mm-hmm.
Heather was the only one who commented on the last podcast.
I forgot what the word was, but that makes sense. Hi,
Tongue.
Heather. Oh, yeah.
You said tongue.
Yeah.
So, all right, guys. Grace and peace to you.